Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Holly Macve called Golden Eagle. So I've been told by a lot of my international audience that they tend to be a little bit perplexed at the larger number of country artists that I cover in comparison with other critics. And that is worth calling out because almost by design, country is a highly regional genre, born out of American traditions and archetypes that haven't really crossed over around the world in the same way. I mean, sure, Canada's got a country scene, and to some extent so does Australia, driven out to the rougher, wilder frontiers, but you go to England or the rest of Europe? Well, country music does exist in pockets across the Atlantic, but remember what I said about how country music to this day has a terrible web presence problem? Unfortunately, this is also still very true internationally as well, and thus without good grassroots promoting, it's hard to hear about acts coming up in the UK or the rest of Europe. And thus, I'm actually pretty happy that my audience, especially on Patreon, decided to recommend the debut album of Holly Macve. Born in Ireland and growing up in the UK, she came up with a musical family and seems to have gravitated towards the vintage-leaning, smoky flavors of country music that's popular in the indie scene right now, especially among its female artists. Now, I've covered a lot of variations of the style, from Angel Olsen to Lindy Ortega, from Cheryl Desiree to Whitney Rose, and I was curious to see where Holly Macve's English influence would shift the music, perhaps inject a heavier folk touch or a slightly different instrumental palette. Either way, I was in some uncharted territory when I picked up her debut album, Golden Eagle. So, alright, what did I find here? Well, honestly, I'm not really much of a fan of this. Yeah, this caught me off guard, but I won't say in a good way, because I didn't find Golden Eagle enjoyable at all. In fact, I found it a lot more tedious and frustrating than I was expecting for this sort of country album, with some pretty serious issues almost across the board, from writing to performance to the overall sound. I'm not gonna say that it's precisely bad. I can definitely hear the audience for this, and you'll understand why I'm saying that momentarily, but for me, no, I wasn't really a fan, at least not on this project. It just didn't work. And yeah, we need to start off with Holly Macve herself and the fundamentals. Her voice just does not work for me whatsoever. And initially it was kind of hard to put my finger on why until we started getting the breathy, misty multi-tracking, and then it hit me. She sounds a lot like Lana Del Rey. The same languid, tremulous delivery that's walking that thin line of sincerity, just with the thicker country accent that tries and fails to obscure how often she slips off key, trying to capture that same sort of old school vintage flavor, and yet rarely selling the deeper emotional intensity or texture that can make Angel Olsen or Karen Jonas or Courtney Marie Andrews more compelling. Now, to Macve's credit, she does seem to have a better idea of her range than Lana Del Rey can at some points, and thus she avoids the baby voice crooning that I found so intolerable on Lana Del Rey records with the past. But when you also realize that this album is going to take its sweet goddamn time and never really ratchet up the intensity or tension or kick into a decent rollick, I resign myself for a long, frustrating listen that's cribbing from many of the very same desaturated textures that I found so tedious back on Ultraviolence in 2014. Alright, you know what, that's not entirely fair. When this album does build a little bit of energy, it can be pleasant enough, I guess. Heartbreak Blues coasts on some liquid tonal interplay, that's not bad. The added strings that fill up a little bit more than mix against the acoustic blur of Shell, easily the only thing I actually like about that song. Timbuktu picks up a hint of a bass line and drums on the hook, that was welcome. And No One Has the Answer probably has the most defined groove of the entire album. And you know what? I'll give credit to the corner in my mind for actually having some darkness in the smoky vibe and some of the minor tones there. Probably one of the best songs here. And yet, even with all that, it's not like this album builds up any sense of momentum or greater texture in any of the instruments. The pianos are all very muted and softened. The acoustic guitar lines, they all blur together. Not a lot of texture or bite there. By the time the last two 6-minute ballads kick in for the closing two songs, you're gonna start feeling this album is a lot longer than it really is. I'd argue this could have been avoided if the melodies felt a little bit more complex or coalesced into stronger hooks or built some swell or bombast or added more detailed or textured instrumentation. But the truth is that this style of slower, more contemplative, more stripped back instrumentation is intended to draw more attention to Holly Macve in her writing. And if that's the case, well, there's definitely work that needs to be done here. Let's start off with the technical issues, because for as bare bare bones as much as the writing can feel in a lot of its structure and poetry, there's really no excuse for so many rhymes to get dropped. I get that it's intended to feel like that McVie's untangling her rambling thoughts, but it also has a side effect of making this album drag even further and compromise some of that momentum, and that's the last thing that she should want. But then we get to the content, and look, I'm really not all that impressed, mostly because any sense of narrative or storytelling feels pretty thin, and when we do get, I don't like, with McVie almost always feeling like a passive actor in her own story. The record begins with the return home, which for no explained reason she is not welcomed by her father, raising the specter of a sin in her past that her current paramour can apparently look beyond. But even that relationship doesn't seem like it's gonna last, as the next two songs seems to show McVie warning that she's going to end things thanks to her own lack of trust, thanks to baggage from another guy in her past, but it's not actually something that she opts to do of her own accord. That's one reason why I found Shell so profoundly frustrating as a song. She clearly doesn't think that she's in a fit state to be in a relationship at this point, and she's then trying to sabotage things with the silent treatment to this guy instead of actually taking the mature, responsible step and ending it. In other words, it's all melodramatic as all hell, but the understated framing and a lot of the delivery makes it seem like McVie's decisions are dramatically justified, which they're not if you think about it. This isn't maturity, it's stringing this guy along because you don't want to deal with the consequences of the breakup at that point. So when the next few songs she then cuts and runs and then blames it on her own fear and personal issues and her own damage, or on No One Has the Answer says that nobody really can justify their actions or purpose. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm calling bullshit here. Having been on the receiving end of this a few too many times, I'm not sympathetic to you, especially when on the title track she frames it all as, you know what, she's just setting this guy free. And thus, you know what, this arc maybe could have worked and had some melancholic power to it if it all felt like McVie was learning something, or moving past her fears and her old love, or facing very real consequences beyond just dumping this new guy. But her refusal to engage with any of the complex emotional questions here instead has her blow something that might have actually worked down the line, which she even references on the title track. It's probably not McVie's intention, and maybe some of this is coming from my own personal emotional baggage with this, but it all feels incredibly manipulative with this guy, self-absorbed and really self-destructive in a way that this low-key, understated, dramatic framing cannot justify. Especially if she just needed time to process her issues, this guy probably would have understood and stepped aside for a bit. She's certainly framed that way on the shell that he is that sort of good guy, she's just acting badly. And while I get we're not really supposed to sympathize with McVie directly, we are supposed to see the drama in her struggle. And you know what, maybe it's just a factor of her delivery or the presentation or the basic as hell writing and thin framing, but no, I'm not on board with this. Not in the order and arc that these songs are presented here, but even if you look at the record in pieces, just song by song, it's still utterly lacking in momentum, and I'm not remotely crazy about the very muted production or McVie's delivery. I've heard some comparisons to Patsy Cline, but that's from people who don't know Patsy Cline. She needed a much deeper core of intensity to match her material, something that feels oddly absent here. But you know what, all that being said, if I separate some of my own issues with the content, I can kind of see the appeal, and as a whole, it's never so much bad as it feels anathema to how I would handle a very similar situation. And I don't see the level of artifice that has alienated me from Lana Del Rey in the past, I'll give her that. It seems like it's coming from a genuine place. As such, I'm giving this a light 5 out of 10. It's hard to recommend from me, but if anything I said intrigues you, guess it's worth a listen. Otherwise, you know what, I'm sure there's more to actual quality of UK country music. I'm not hearing it here. Sorry. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know I came down on this a lot harder than really a lot of other critics, so if you want to call me I'm wrong, the poll is right there, there's your opportunity. And I've also got the link to buy in the description below if you guys actually do want to get this album and you're curious. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get more involved in my Patreon, the link to my schedule is right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on it, or occasionally a little bit more if I throw up a surprise round, and once a week on Saturdays you guys get to add records to my schedule, and it's getting pretty full right now. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.